This is Metabolic Mastery, a core medical technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert. This is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we've got a special treat again. We've got Daniel Krumback with us. And today we're going to dive into different zoning methods. This will be a fun conversation. This is kind of a hot topic. And there are just so many different methods to choose from. And there's different pros and cons, and so let's dive in.
Yeah, it is a hot topic. It is a popular thing. You hear a lot of influencers and online physicians that have big followings and stuff talk about zone 2 and how they define zone 2. And sometimes I feel like, oh, that's a good definition, and most of the time it makes me cringe a little bit because my definition of zone 2 may differ slightly from their definition of zone 2. And when I tell people things like that the way they define zone 2 is different than the way I define it, you'll hear people be like, wait, there's different definitions of zone 2? And it's like, there's actually different definitions of every metric, aerobic, anaerobic threshold, all those, different metrics are all defined differently by different people. As we look at, there's various ways to look at the data, and so each kind of interpretive method leads to somewhat different interpretation of the results.
Welcome to exercise physiology, right?
Yeah.
What's funny is I know exactly what you mean, but once you've been in this game long enough, you realize there's really one definite way of calculating it, yet the interpretation of what it represents is huge.
Right.
And some people will look at it from a point of view of this is where I train or this is where I'm working hard. It really has nothing to do with that. There we go. That's a look on your face that you always get with people. Is sort of like, no, there is only one thing that represents a zone, and that's where you change fuel sources based upon ATP production rates.
Right. And that's my method as well. Like, that's what I like to use as well, is what are the fuel sources that we're using? That to me defines each zone. Yeah.
Agreed. And if we were really honest, there wouldn't be 5 zones.
Yeah.
There'd only be 4.
Yeah.
Well, so that's the interesting thing there, I think, is like you look into the methods on zones, and there are so many different ways, right? There's 5 zones, 4 zones, 3 zones, 10 zones, 8 zones.
Yeah.
And I think you bring up a significant point of like, where are we seeing different metabolic shifts, different changes in efficiency, right? And so I think if we can understand it in terms of energy systems, that makes a lot more sense, because so many of them are like, hey, we're going to look at percent of your heart rate max or percent of your VO₂ max or whatever, which is like, yes, in some sense, we're anchoring it to a physiological variable, but your percent VO₂ max doesn't give you any insight into the substrate, right? And what we want to be able to see is what's happening at a substrate level, so that we can say like, hey, this is what's happening with your metabolism at any point along the way.
Yeah, I often even break it down into 3 zones. You have a comfortable zone, a comfortably uncomfortable zone, and an uncomfortable zone. When I'm trying to explain to people like the different training zones, and the comfortable zone is kind of zone 1 and 2 lumped together, and zone 3 is kind of the comfortably uncomfortable, and the zone 5 is kind of 4 and 5 lumped together. And so in its simplicity, if we're not talking about substrate utilization, that's kind of how I try to simplify it down for people. Is like, the comfortable, I could do this all day. The uncomfortable or comfortably uncomfortable is kind of the zone 3 of like, yeah, I could do this for a half hour to an hour and a half, and I'm fine. And then the zone 4 and 5 is kind of the clock's ticking because I'm working hard enough that I can't do this forever, or for a prolonged period of time. And so I use those as a simplifier. But yeah, I agree with you. Metabolically, there really is 4 zones more than 5. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if we first just defined it by ATP production rates,
mm-hmm.
and then applied them to training, that would make sense. But only in the case that you can identify which zone or which physiological system is letting them down. Which is efficient, which is inefficient. And you can't get that from a watch or a predictive VO₂max or a lactate or a NIRS. You can't get all the information necessary to determine that. I mean, that's what's good about doing. And I hate metabolic testing, as you know. By doing physiological testing using O₂ and CO₂, we can definitively be able to see the differences in there. Now we can have adjuncts that will help support our decision making process with it. But one of the major conversations I have with people is that want to buy a device like ours is that they, we also want to be able to do lactate, and it's always like, why? I did lactate for 8 years, and I'm talking 8 solid years of doing lactate and analyzing it. And there's only one point that you can truly recognize, and that's the rapid increase. I'm seeing all kinds of algorithms being made to identify small fluctuations in lactate levels, to identify zone 2 and 3 or 1 and 2. Anyway, no, you can't. There's no definitive change. There's nothing that you can actually recognize. They're doing that because it's the only data they have, and therefore they have to zone with what they've got.
Yeah.
And it's forcing them to kind of make up things. And, in the last, 4 to 6 weeks, they're selling software for looking at lactate levels to be able to define zones. And you're going, well, that's not the purpose. In fact, my favorite question to them is, well, what does lactate threshold represent to you? Because it's such a personal question now, because nobody's really defined it.
Yeah, right.
And so, it's a rapid increase in lactate levels. In other words, you've kind of switched to another fuel source and you've maximized your lactate utilization, and it's elevating. And like you guys said the other week, well, so what? It doesn't matter. It's a relatively harmless acid. It doesn't affect your performance in any way, but it is a marker that something happened there.
Yeah.
But that's all you know. But you can talk to a ton of people. I considered a 3/4 switch as a possible indicator. Other people would consider it a 4/5 switch. That spot between the zones themselves.
Yeah.
But really, it's something's changed systemically, which doesn't directly measure anything that's happening at the cell, except for the fact that if you poke their ear or poke their finger, that something systemically has changed probably 30 seconds before then.
Well, that's one of my problems with it is the sampling rate. Like, maybe we could derive more from it if we had continuous sampling, but because it's like, well, once a lap, we're gonna poke your ear and take another blood sample, or once every 3 laps or whatever. So you've got such big time gaps in between that it may have happened 2 minutes ago and we don't really know, because depending on your sampling rates. And so I always struggle with that with lactate testing is, one data point even per minute. That's a lot of pokes. And and still, like, you miss in 1 minute, you can go up a significant amount in your heart rate or respiratory rate or things like that. So are we really catching those inflection points or not?
Yeah. And I must admit, when you have O₂ and CO₂, you already know where that's going to go up.
Right. Yeah. You already see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So rather than taking somebody's blood for no reason at all, I think it's popular because of the fact that it's only about $600 to buy, and coaches can do it and get some idea that they're doing science.
Yeah.
Which is a real shame. And anything within science that you multiply by a percentage is math, and I don't like math mixed in my science.
Yeah, well, no, I think that's such an interesting point, right? Is it's when we're looking for, and we've talked about this before, when we're looking at population data, percentages can be great, right? It tells us what trends we see in population. We can look at things like risk and the such. But yeah, on the individual level, it's like, especially with the O₂ and CO₂ data, we're getting real live data from the person, and then to run it through a percentage just seems kind of wild.
Right.
Because then it's like, well, let's just ignore most of what's happening physiologically and put it in these nice, neat little boxes and not actually use the data that's going to help us to design the best training regime.
Right. So most kind of common zoning techniques are to take some kind of peak physiological signal marker like anaerobic threshold or heart rate max or VO₂max, using one of those markers and then saying, okay, we're going to take their heart rate when they reach that point and say it's going to be 50 to 60% is zone 1, 60 to 70% is zone 2, and so on. And so it becomes fairly arbitrary. And quite frankly, we could have done that without running a VO2 test at all. We could have just said, show me your Garmin. When's the last time you did a high intensity workout? What's the highest heart rate you've achieved in the last month or so? Okay, there's our heart rate max, and we'll just go. And that's what the different apps and watches and things do, because that makes sense as a method.
Yeah.
What's the highest heart rate you've achieved? And we'll just take percentages of that. So if we're doing a VO2 test and then using those methods, it kind of leaves a lot on the table in terms of accuracy of the zones.
Yeah.
You're taking one point at 1 second during a 9 to 12 minutes of data, and you're going, that just seems like a waste to me.
Yeah.
And we know why it looks for 1 point is because the algorithms, it makes it easy for the algorithm to find it. What I like about KORR, unlike anybody or any equipment I've worked with before, is the fact that we give you 4 zoning options, including a 5th, which is manual. A lot of other devices they bury one algorithm in it.
Yeah.
And it spits out their zones. They don't even tell you what it is. And if you ask, sometimes they say it's proprietary, and you're going, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
There is only one definition of all these things.
Yeah.
Inherently, you understand why they exist. Because it's easy to find that particular point and multiply it by percentage. Even with the Cardio Coach Pro, it allows, a lot of people don't know this, but you can actually change the percentages that are built in.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's a bit scary to us. You're going, oh my God, what are people going to do to this? Because it doesn't adhere to the absolute rule of how to calculate percentages of a certain number itself. But I do think that, the fact that you're offered 4 or 5 different methods, and like you were talking before, if everything was kind of similar in its processes of trying to find the same things, why do their zones change so significantly when you change from one method to another, whether it's percentage of anaerobic threshold to percentage of max heart rate or percentage of VO₂max? The numbers are all over the damn place.
Yeah. So wide variation.
Oh yeah. So you're going, we're respecting people's education and background and personal beliefs by providing it. But for those people that really want to look at it as being, a change in substrate utilization, then we give you the opportunity to be able to do that manually. Mm-hmm. And it's a great discussion of what each zone then should represent.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So let's talk about that, because I feel like there are so many definitions of what they are. Like, what are we trying to accomplish with each zone? Why are there even zones in the first place? Like, what does substrate utilization have to do with all this?
Yeah.
Well, I think we are forced into zones because of the fact there must be some practical application that's easy to apply by the athlete or by the general population. And heart rate was selected because it's the most variable and it responds to physiological stress the best. I still believe in heart rate, but not for the reasons a lot of other people, they say, well, you don't use wattage, you don't use speed. I said, no, those are measures of output. They're not a measure of your physiology.
Yeah.
And just trying to get them to calm the hell down. Yes, we will look at wattage as an output related to what the work that you're doing. A lot of people just look at VO₂max, but they don't look at their ability to do work there. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Somebody who has a lower VO₂max than you that can do more work, it's still going to kick your ass on race day.
Yeah, absolutely. We
So-
see that all the time.
So exactly. So what we've got to do is we got to get back to what it represents truly, and then be able to explain that to people in a very simple way. So in my case, zone 1 indicates the intensity at which that you're stimulating O2 delivery beyond its requirement at the cell. So you're hyperoxygenating the area itself. So we go, okay, well, how are we going to identify that? Well, why is that important in the first place? Is because the fact you want to get rid of CO2 and you want to bring in O2 to the cell to help it recover. So, okay, well, we're going to name that zone 1. And it's going to be mainly, we know it's mainly fat oxidation, and it will represent recovery. So that's all of zone 1 kind of fits those things. How we can tell, obviously the only way you can tell, and I need to make it clear, is only with O2 and CO2. That's the only way to identify fat and carbohydrate utilization. There's a lot of devices out right now that are only O2. You cannot tell substrate utilization with it. And therefore you can't really identify zone 1 and zone 2, because really those zones are identified by their fat and carbohydrate contribution. So some people will use, like everybody talks about, first of all, they'll do a fat max test. I don't even know what the hell that is. There's no such thing as a fat max test. You're going to do a VO2 test, and you're going to be able to identify fat max. That's the area in which you're burning the most amount of fat in relation to the least amount of carbohydrate.
Right.
So they're both moving. So you may find a peak here, but the CO2 or the O2 is risen up here, or the carbohydrate use is raised up here. It's not fat max. It's the relationship between the two of them. So quite logically, we think of recovery is you're seeing this huge O2 delivery and utilization, and you're seeing a huge amount of fat being used and almost no carbohydrate. And that's a clear indication that you're in recovery zone. And then going to zone 2, why is it important? Well, I mean, besides everybody chatting about it, when you are not metabolically sound, in other words, you can't use oxygen well, and you can't use fat well. You have to do training very specific to zone 2, but not just zone 2. So this is where I have a little bit of difference of opinion on it. So what you want to be able to do is there's a contribution from both fat and carbohydrate, but fat at a much more significant level. Now, what a lot of people do is they'll build an algorithm. There's a point in which fat's coming down and carbohydrates coming up, and it's called the crossover.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the end of zone 2. It would happen a long time before that. But a lot of companies in their analysis will use that point because it's easy to find with an algorithm. So beware your zoning by certain companies that are using that just strictly because the software can find it easily.
Mm-hmm.
So, and zone 2 represents, like you said, to them, it's the low intensity, high duration work. Well, why is that important? It will increase mitochondrial density and capillarization. There's big battles going on right now, whether it's just that, which is really quite cool because we've been stuck there for a while. So I've been paying a lot of attention to it. It is only required by those who have that issue. In other words, getting somebody who likes doing long, slow stuff, doing more of it's not going to help in any way. And this is where our testing is so helpful. But then again, you have to have testing with O2 and CO2 to identify it.
Exactly.
So for those that are listening that want to be tested and truly identify accurate zoning and determine whether you need to do more there, you really need to be tested by somebody who uses both O2 and CO2.
Well, I think this goes back to that idea that we were talking about a couple weeks ago on the podcast of what's your fitness story, right? Having that substrate data tells us like, hey, this is where you're strong. You're doing a great job in these areas. Keep that up. We're not going to just totally drop that out of the training, but like you mentioned, now let's zoom on this area. Let's focus in on this, and then develop some of the adaptations that are going to help you to perform better, feel better, have a higher metabolic flexibility. And we've got to have the substrate level data again to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the bottom end, right? You're going, what is the ideal way of zoning? Well, when you're first starting off in this, there's nothing wrong with using percentages of something until you learn a different method.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to scare people away. Actually, I want to excite them in the fact that you can start there, but you'll start to see that there's issues with it.
Mm-hmm.
And not all the time. It's like a clock, twice a day it's right. It's going to be right sometimes. But
yeah,
there's so much of your physiological systems that can influence how you respond at different intensities, that can interfere with the mathematics.
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned like the top of zone 2, for example, not being always right at that inflection point, right? That oftentimes you'll see like this increase in carbohydrate metabolism kind of right before that, where fat burn stays about the same in terms of number of fat calories per hour, but all of a sudden your carbohydrate burn really starts to climb. And so, it's those inflection points where you see changes in the slopes of those lines if you're looking at your VE over VO2 and VE over VCO2. So when you see those changes in the slopes and the lines, we talk about substrate utilization because that's a great way to visualize it. But we're getting those numbers from O₂ and CO₂ consumption and production values. And so, when you see that carbohydrate production is really ramping up, even if fat burn is staying relatively the same. And we'll see that even into zone 3 often, that their fat burn doesn't drop off for a while. And people that are fairly well trained, their fat burn will stay there, but their carbohydrate burn has kind of climbed past it. And so it's that inflection point that really signals the top of zone 2, and not necessarily just that arbitrary, well, this is where they crossed over. But they may have crossed over fairly rapidly because of something happening, and it just takes some time before that kind of shows up, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think when you're looking at this and you're looking at plotting aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, which are defined based upon RER, they're plotted right, but they're dead wrong for what they represent to the athlete themselves.
Yeah.
When you talk to people about aerobic threshold, that's the point in which you start doing work. Anaerobic threshold is supposed to represent a switch of fuel systems. But sometimes you'll see them almost on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of cases, that's just breathing wrong. And the fact that something can screw up an honest indication of a change of fuel sources that badly shows you that it doesn't truly respond or represent that particular spot.
Mm.
So I'm sure you guys have all seen, a aerobic threshold to the left and anaerobic within 15 beats of it, yet there's another 7 minutes of test going, and you're going,
Yep.
okay, was the calculation wrong? No, the calculation was always right, based upon O₂ and CO₂ levels, but it's still wrong. It doesn't represent a change of contribution of fuel type to ATP production. So, and that's in a lot of cases, this has to do with the use of VE.
Mm-hmm.
And VE does not truly represent breathing frequency and tidal volume, even though it is. Breathing frequencies can completely screw up ventilatory thresholds, anaerobic thresholds, and lactate thresholds. There's an assumption that their breathing will be normal. But the fact is, if they're a hyperventilator, if they have low volume issues themselves or coordination issues, all your lines, your trend lines that you're looking for, those particular data points will change. I like what you said. It's trend lines and changes of slope lines. it's all the data and looking for sudden inflections or deflections in a particular trend line and seeing how they cross-correlate with each other, it makes a huge difference. But if you don't pay attention to their breathing, then you're not going to know whether that really represents it or everything's off because of a respiratory limitation. And that's why I tend to, that switch, everybody goes, well, where's the first two switches are fairly simple, right? You just zone 1, it's kind of plus or minus fat max is what people think about it. I'm looking for an uptick of carbohydrate utilization is kind of the top of 1. Then I'm looking for that slope line coming together. The beginning of that coming together to be the end of 2. But where do we look for 3, 4, and 5 when after an RER of 1, the fat and carbohydrate information is actually useless? So, and a lot of people use VE, and I'm just going, oh, be careful. Be careful. Sure, it'll work some of the times. But if it's bad VE, not good VE, in other words, if it's hyperventilation with low volumes, you can't trust anything with it. So I always ask people, like, what do you think would represent kind of the end of, if zone 3 is the use of carbohydrate and lactate, what do you think would represent a good indicator when you're moving from to the end of 3 and the beginning of 4? What do you guys?
So I get the way that I define it is probably a little bit different, but I'm looking at like VO₂max as kind of that top indicator. So right, we've hit AT, and then VO₂max says, hey, now I've maxed out my ability to transport oxygen, use it. And so I look at those as supramaximal efforts, right? Like at that top end heart rate zone, I'm going to be using mostly my like ATP CP system to fuel exercise. And so yeah, that's how I look at it.
Yeah.
The problem with that is that's beautiful for zone 5.
Yeah.
But where everybody has trouble is where's the end of 3 and where's the beginning of 4.
So I always look for, where those two lines really start to come together. That inflection point of where are they starting to really merge quite rapidly more than they have been. So they're running somewhat parallel in zone 2. They start to come together in zone 3, and then zone 4 is when you see that rapid drop off. That's where I typically define it.
Yeah. You're using RER, which I think
RER
is where.
Well, I look at CO2, O₂ over CO2, or CO2 over O₂, looking at those graphs and seeing where's that inflection point where they really start to come together, which is essentially RER. Yeah.
But I get what you're saying. We have that difficulty at the high end, right? Is it's like you mentioned, when we go above 1.0, it's not giving us useful data.
Right.
So the way that I think I zone just differently than other people do. So I think we're clear on zone 2. I end zone 3 at AT, and then AT to VO₂max is how I define zone 4, and then zone 5 is just super maximal. And so I'm just using that. Like zone 4 is past the AT when I don't have that 1.0, don't have the RER data being useful, and then to VO₂max I can use those to kind of define that zone 4 high intensity, and then the zone 5 high intensity is super maximal.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear, like, what are you looking at? What are the weaknesses of that method? What are the things that you really like to focus on to kind of dial that in?
And I do a lot of looking at trend lines subtly, like we're talking about. I'm working with an IT specialist, and I'm working with another person that I really respect in the field. They're basically trying to tap my brain, and what we're doing is I'm sending them the points that I've identified as zone switches themselves. We're putting in every metric available. So SMO2, lactate, O₂, CO₂, heart rate, everything in. And we're going, does anything else identify consistently across a spectrum of people that point? And we're just fishing at this particular point and going, it might be something that blows our minds. We've got zone 1 and zone 2 nailed about 95% of the time across the population, male, female.
That's cool.
Now, we think we've found that it is related, but it's all slope lines. It's not a particular point. Is I have them looking at when we start to see, like you said, when do we start to see things start to come together?
Yeah, looking at those deltas.
And yes, and luckily I'm working with a guy who's extremely good at that algorithmically, and then I'm working with a guy who's just, Evan Pycon and I are working together on this, and he is just busting through and applying all the logic to it to see whether we can do it. My goal is one day to come up with a whole new method of zoning, which goes back to its roots. This is some form of switch based upon ATP production, and I'm going to try and bring everybody back to what it really is. For two reasons. Number one, we need to find out where they suck so that we can train them properly, and find out why. And why, that's the other thing is, doing a lactate threshold and finding a threshold doesn't tell you anything about why it happened. So it's completely and utterly useless, except for I hope whatever I give them to do will move it to the right. And that's it. Whereas you use metabolic analysis and you can identify, the respiratory system is incapable of responding at this particular point. Or O₂ delivery is good, but offloading utilization is not, indicating more of a metabolic problem. So we're trying to identify, and I do believe we're very close. I got another meeting tonight where we're just going through and looking at slope lines. The main reason that things change, if we asked ourselves physiologically, what would change the first right away and most consistently by changing from zone 3 to 4? What physiological system will respond the quickest?
Are you talking in terms of like glycolytic versus oxidative versus,
or just heart rate versus breathing rate versus
respiratory versus metabolic? Just think of the signaling pathways or cardiovascular based upon signaling at the cell. And I just go back to that because I'm always looking for that. Where's the first thing that's going to go off? What's the first indicator so I can go to that slope line? And obviously, as pH drops and the cell becomes more acidotic, it's picked up by chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors. The brain sends a signal first to the respiratory system to breathe faster.
Yeah.
So I use respiratory frequency. The only time it doesn't work is when you've got these interesting people who are trying to hang on to like 26 breaths going into zone 4.
Yeah.
And you can spot them and go, well, I can't use that here because he's been indoctrinated into some kind of cult. So I'm going to have to try and fix him and realize that his cerebral cortex is getting in the way of his midbrain, which is much better at doing this than he is. And it's a natural response to not dying. Would be, I suggest getting the way out of the way of these things. Yeah. So I use breathing frequency a ton. And if you look by breaking it down and looking at slope lines, you will see specific slope line increases and decreases depending on the intensity they're at. Which an algorithm can find much better than one point, but a change in slope lines. So that's what I end up doing is I end up looking at that. They're now looking at whether we can actually do that automatically, which would be very cool for people.
Yeah. Well, and I think just something that I want to make sure, because we kind of poo-pooed on algorithms earlier, but in this case, we're not just we're not using algorithms to find a percentage. We're using algorithms to look for these changes in slope in the actual breath
Right.
data, in the actual VO2, VCO2 curves. And so this isn't something where we're like estimating, we're just taking the actual data and then allowing the algorithm to find those points and
Right.
flag them.
So there are fixed algorithms
Well,
versus flexible algorithms that adapt to the person and that test and that data set versus fixed algorithms like a certain percentage of a max value that we record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in order, you go back to this whole concept of what a slope is. It's a series of data points.
Right.
Yeah, it's inherently needs to be there. In fact, there needs to be at least, if you look at the stock market, and I teach this all the time, if you want to see a trend, you have to at least have changes from a baseline of 4 responses to determine whether there's any trend going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I try and get people to use the stock market when I'm trying to teach them of, are you seeing what you're really seeing? Or in all honesty, you have no idea where it's going to go next. Luckily, the body it gives you that, and you can go back to the beginning of it, which is great, to be able to say, something happened there. And that's all we're saying is something happened there, but not by multiplying it by a percentage, which is poor. And I'm with you. There's tons of people that you have great conversations. You go, well, how come I can run an hour in zone 4? And you're going, well, either your zone's wrong,
Yeah.
or you've adapted your systems to such a degree that you can actually tolerate that, right?
Yeah. And there are some people that have. It's pretty impressive, but yeah.
Yeah, and if you're doing zone 5 work and you can do it longer than 30 to 90 seconds, you haven't found zone 5. It's nice and simple.
Yeah.
You go back to its true roots. We need to be able to identify zones. We need to know how you perform in each of the zones. We need to be able to identify limitations, and we need to give you the appropriate exercise prescription that will change your physiology to make you better.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the data is off the test. It's to the right, and you can look at those people and go, you know what? That was your max effort that day, but you have a lot more in your tank. And they just look at you and going, oh, no, that was the hardest I could work. And I'm going, nah.
Yeah.
And you can tell. And that's the joy of having, there's no other metric than metabolic analysis with O₂ and CO₂ that could possibly provide you that. I mean, I survived a long time with just O₂. I had a nice Cosmed FitMate Pro, great piece of kit in the day. But that transition of having O₂ and CO₂, and be able to have that extra data, and I add to that with using NIRS. So I use both Train Red and I use Moxie, and it's just extra data. Can I zone accurately with NIRS? No, I can't. You can't zone any way accurately unless you're using metabolic analysis with O₂ and CO₂.
Well, and I think that goes back to what you said earlier of like, we can bring in some of these other things supplementally, but still the workhorse is going to be that VO2, VCO2 data and then it's just, I kind of think of it like, do they even have these on radios anymore? Like it's like you can do the big switches through and then there's like the fine tuning knob. And I think just those things can give you some of the fine tuning, but without being able to say like these are the major events that are occurring, then it's just you're only getting part of the story.
And I think again, it's not just for the training sessions, but it's to identify the limitations in each, and then therefore to be able to adjust. And people aren't thinking of this; they just they'll just get their zones, or people will do a test and hand out their zones and say, "These are your zones," and you're going, whoa! You've just now thrown the baby out with the bathwater here. Yeah, you're only getting started with what you need to do. If you look at, I believe that zone 5 will be clearly identified as one of the best ways of increasing mitochondrial density and capillarization. And the reason why is, like I said, I think it's the difference between type 1 and type 2 fibers. And we're getting into the type 1s when you're doing zone 5, it's going to be helpful. Are we going to find that zone 3 and 4 also increase mitochondria? Yes, if they haven't done that training before, right? the problem is that almost everybody's stuck in 3 and 4.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't even get to 5. I hate finding a limitation that I know would improve with zone 5 training, but they can't breathe well enough to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I love this talk about limitations. It's kind of this idea of sometimes you have to train, right? Like,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
before I can work on these things, I've got to address the limitation. And so I love this idea of you talking about that, because it's one thing to have a set of training zones, but it's another to have that conversation. Like, hey, what's limiting you from being able to do? What have you been doing? Right? This is going to tell the story of what you've been doing.
Yeah.
But being able to bring those limitations, I love what you're talking about, because then it says it's that, well, here's what to do, right? Like, we want to get here, and we tell people that sometimes. It's like, hey, it's clear in the evidence base that high intensity, especially at zone 5, like you mentioned, is really good for driving those high-end adaptations, upping VO₂max, increasing mitochondrial density, et cetera. But you're not prepared for that right now, and you're probably going to have burnout, injury. Like, it's just not going to go well. And so let's train let's train your system up so it can tolerate that level of work, that level of activity,
Right.
and then we can dial in those adaptations.
Well, and so often people spend so much time in zone 3 and 4 that the gas tank is empty for really being able to push harder. And so there's that problem, and then kind of the respiratory issues like you're talking about of, can they even breathe hard enough so they don't feel like they're dying to get there?
You're gonna hammer home a limitation.
Yeah.
And I've said this before with you guys. One of my rules with people is don't be a dick. So don't give them something to do that they can't do. It's mean. Yeah. It's a bit evil. Whereas I say, listen, you really need zone 5 work, but I can't get you to work there now. So I want 6 to 8 weeks of hard work on respiratory training to be able to increase your, let's say, it's capacity, capability, coordination. It all depends on what we find.
Yeah.
To be able to get you so that you can now access it and use it. And one of the delights of having a device like ours is you can open it in a free mode and get them to run zone 5 with nothing but VT and breathing frequency up on a graph. And say, I'm going to give you intervals to do hooked up to this, because I want you to know what it feels like. And I want you to apply what I've just been training you on. And so you could do a 30-minute session with them once, and they go, oh, that's what this should feel like. I can feel when I'm starting to lose my breathing, and I could do that. So there's very functional ways of using our device as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't get enough time to do that fun stuff, but it's a great way. If you got a respiratory limitation that you've trained in, they're just not applying and they just can't understand it. One of the best things you can do is throw up whatever metric that you want them to change. And usually it's breathing frequency and tidal volumes, and say, you're losing your volume, your frequencies are driving. Get a control over that trend line. And usually only have to do it once.
Yeah. I agree with you. The open-ended testing mode, so the VO2 long testing mode, is one of my favorites. There's all kinds of things you can do with it. And you're kind of only limited by your creativity. I love to put people on there and say, stay in zone 2, and we'll give you real-time feedback as to whether or not you really are in zone 2. And because what that feels like is often different than what people think it feels like. People will say, do the talk test and things like that. I find the talk test to not be terribly helpful or accurate.
No. No.
And so being able to just say, like, hey, look, I want you to keep these lines looking like this the whole time, and avoid that crossover point, avoid it. When you see your carbohydrates start to climb up in relation to your fat burn, like you're going too hard, back down. And being able to show them in real time what that feels like and how those transitions start to happen and things. So I'll do that, where I'll have somebody kind of go to the top of their zone 2 with speed alone, and then incline, and then kind of a combination of speed and incline. So they get to feel what each of those feel like, and really get an idea of zone 2, especially if somebody's struggling with zone 2 and they're like, oh, how slow does it really have to be? How or things like that. Like, well, let's put you on there and show you what those things look like. And so we'll do like a half hour, 40-minute session of just hanging out in zone 2 and what that should look like on a day-to-day basis. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting to them to realize how subtle it is, and we're not suggesting that this is the absolute point, and this is what we're trying to get across. We're trying to come up with a new name for it. We're referring to it as a switch or a phase, because definitively that particular heart rate that we picked for the beginning of one or beginning one and the end of another, it can be a little more subtle than that.
Yeah,
but it should be within 2 or 3 beats. So what you're saying there is really important. I think summarizing this, zones need to be defined by ATP production rates, which is based upon intensity and stress, your physiological response. It can be applied there logically into a training session, whether it's limitation based or whether it's just training based. Of I want to do this kind of work with this much recovery. And the only true way of getting it is there's no other way except for metabolic analysis with O₂ and CO₂, because you need that data. So if you really truly want somebody to zone you properly, you need the right device and you need the person with the right abilities to be able to interpret the data. And you should be getting a lot more information than just your VO₂max and some accurate zones. And zones aren't zones. We all know that they're all over the place, and a majority of them are wrong, and all trying to achieve the one thing that we can.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, and I want to go back to something that you said earlier when you were talking about looking at individuals' data. You said it depends. And I think that's a key phrase because, like you mentioned, in the way that this is often talked about, this is the one true way, and it never depends, right? It's absolutely this, it's absolutely that, and we just get these very sharp lines. And what you mentioned, like physiology, it happens on a spectrum. There's these shifts occurring over time. And we can point to these like, hey, in this range, these are the changes that we're seeing. And so we know that there's some stability here. We know there's some stability here. And so, but those are going to change depending on a person's, limitations, depending on the training that they've done in the past. And so if we just don't allow for any of that flexibility, we don't allow for any of that room, we don't allow for it depends, then I think that just gets us into a very dogmatic way of thinking, where we miss the nuance of individual physiology, and being able to dive into this data and see like, hey, this is what's actually occurring. And I think another thing to understand that people miss with zoning, zones in general, is they're like this idea that adaptations are restricted to a single zone. As soon as I'm out of zone 1, I don't get any more of those adaptations. As soon as I'm out of zone 2, I don't get any more of those adaptations. And again, physiology is not so discrete. It's on a spectrum. And so what we're trying to do with the zones is target those energy systems, like you said, so that then we can target the adaptations that we're looking for. And we just know that if I'm training in this specific zone in this specific way, then I'm doing my best to target those adaptations while also allowing for sufficient recovery, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. You're getting the most bang for your buck with the least risk for overtraining, injury, fatigue, things like that.
Yeah. And it's not that like zones, 3 and 4, where people tend to exercise, don't drive adaptations. They do, like we discussed. But I love what you said earlier too, is, well, if we want to maximize these adaptations, then we've got to add that different. You've already been doing this, right? We've kind of maxed out the adaptations at that range. And so if we want to move to the next level of performance, we've got to focus in on these other areas and prepare you to train there so that you can optimize your performance gains.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about it is when they have trained 3 and 4 a lot, and I've given them zone 4 and zone 5 intervals, let's say, and let's say they have a really good zone 2. Well, we're just going to go to maintenance on that once a week, unless it doesn't match the load requirements for their particular event they're training for.
Yeah.
It's always going to match reality and their actual end goal.
Yeah.
But when you drive somebody through zone 5 intervals, where do you think they're going through?
Yeah.
They're going through 3 and 4 multiple times on the way up and all the way down.
Yeah.
And the one thing that drives me crazy is nobody uses zone 1. It's recovery. So every zone 5 effort needs to recover in zone 1.
Yeah.
So instead, what you're seeing is you're seeing people doing super high intensity intervals, and they're giving them time or a work to rest ratio.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that it depends on the person. If they recover very quickly and they're in good shape, the length of time that they require is significantly shorter than those that are deconditioned. So how can the ratios work out? If you know you're kind of stuck to a 30 to 90 second top end interval, the interval doesn't start till you get there. So it's going to be a lot easier for the deconditioned person to get there if they can tolerate it, and a lot longer for them to get down. So they're inherently, the ratios are wrong. So I always tell people, if you do zone 5 intervals, your recovery doesn't start to get zone 1. And this makes it really tough for the guys that are in shape, because it takes them a long time. It takes them a long time to get up there, but a short recovery. So their ratios inherently change. And I'm so tired of people going, zone 1, that's your recovery zone. That's the end of the conversation. They never use it again.
Never use it, yeah.
And you're going, did you just hear what you said? You said it was recovery, so freaking start using it as recovery.
Right.
And it works. All of a sudden, you find out that the length of time it takes you to get up there is longer, so therefore your interval is longer. And the length of time it takes to come down, it comes down, so therefore your recovery is shorter. And your intervals will change appropriate to your physiological adaptations.
Do you find that using Moxy helps drive that home because you can show them that the muscle hasn't fully recovered using the muscle oxygen data?
Yeah, I do find it helpful. For interval, especially even during the testing that you're doing, right? So a lot of people don't know about X1X testing, but it's a really good adjunct to ramp testing. And I've been doing X1X testing actually longer than I've been doing ramp testing. And it's that ability to, because of the fact that they're going to do, let's say, somewhere between 3 and 5 minute steps, and they're going to repeat the same steps twice with a 1 minute rest in between, you can see how they recover in between each one. So at times you can have them in zone 4 and 1 minute's enough for them to recover. And you're going, but you just gave them a 3 minute stage. And in 1 minute, their SMO2's back and their VO2's back. You're going, that ratio that would have come out of the book would have had you resting so much too long. But if you pay attention to O2 recovery and CO2 and CO2 clearance and SMO2, so the three of them I look at and go, actually, you kind of suck at recovering, and therefore we're going to have to adjust your ratios around it a little bit. So I do find SMO2 extremely helpful on that side. I'm now been asked to be involved in something huge, international. We talked about the whole continuous lactate. I'm now been asked to be the metabolic expert in this discussion on whether continuous lactate measurement could possibly be an adjunct to heart rate. And you can imagine asking somebody who has done it for years that doesn't really like it. But I thought, this is, maybe.
Yeah.
It's just something else to throw into the pot. And that was always my view with the other project I'm working on is, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
We might be able to identify something really simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And that with continuous lactate monitoring, I think there maybe is more information that we could glean from that. We just don't really know because we don't have that yet.
Right.
And not reliable either. Apparently there are a few systems now, but
it'd have to be blood sampling though. The current ones use sweat lactate, and it's just not reliable.
Right. And so that we'll see as the technology improves if that is helpful at all. But it's kind of one of those
you've either got you're dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're not, and you're inventive, and you believe in intuition and innovation, and it's always been the one thing that anytime I got an award in the military of any kind, it was always innovation. It was always looking at something from a different perspective, seeing something that is irrational, and going, I understand why it exists. You don't disrespect it. You understand why it exists and its limitations and the reason why it was designed that way. But you're going, we don't have to be that way. There's these are all the things that could mess that up.
Yeah.
And I think that's the fun part of our job.
Yeah.
Well, I just thought of two things around that. So one, you take like when Orville and Wilbur Wright, right, built the first airplane. Oh, this can't be done, right? They had the best engineers in the nation working on it, throwing tons of money at it. And, two owners of a bicycle shop, right? And ended up creating the first flight. They weren't constrained by the limitations of the scientific dogma at the time. I was listening to a podcast the other day. I think it was it Harvey Firestone? It was one of those early manufacturers where he wouldn't let the engineers keep logs of the failures, because he didn't want the new people that came in to look at that and say, oh, we tried that, that's been done, we can't do that. And as a result, they end up making, some pretty big breakthroughs in tire technologies, different things like that. And so, it's when we're doing any new scientific endeavor, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, but if we are only constrained by what they did, then that limits what we can do in the future, right? We want to stand on their shoulders so that we can see off into the horizon and see what's possible. We don't want to put blinders on, because then we'll miss opportunities that are available for us. And so I think it's this idea of like, yes, we want to respect the science and use that as a springboard to get to the next discovery. And if we close our eyes, it's like I can't remember who said it, but they're basically like, science progresses one funeral at a time.
Yeah,
I like that. It's dark, but it's funny.
Yeah. Well,
it's something that keeps me interested, and luckily I'm at a point in my life where I'm getting phone calls, and it's sort of like, we like your brain, we like the way you think, because you're not going to think traditionally, and you always get that quiet contemplation where you're going, this could possibly work.
Mm-hmm.
If I had my bias from my previous experience with it, I would be stridently against it. Instead, you're just going, this is different. It's a change. And plus, wouldn't it be nice if we had something that the general population could wear that would be easy for them to use and would be scientific based?
Yeah.
And so wouldn't that be great? So if they can, put a patch on that they can leave on for a month, that measures directly.
Yeah.
And it gives them direct feedback. It would be neat.
Yeah. Might put us out of a job, but it would be really neat. No, there would still be the need actually for VO2 testing, VCO2 testing, like that still would be super important.
Where did they come to try and validate and give proof that it works?
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody comes back to metabolic analysis, O₂, CO₂. Everybody comes back to that because it consistently has been the best method for years and years and years.
Yep.
So anybody that tries to prove it themselves, whether it BIA or whatever, all through the years, has always said, we're comparing against this, and we're going, it's nice to be that. I like being
that. Exactly. Yeah, whenever you're the gold standard, if you will, and that term gets so overused, but when you're the standard that others measure against, that's really helpful. So, yeah, awesome. Well, it's so interesting. We could talk about the zones forever. We could also, I'm really excited. In a future call, I'll kind of tease the next subject.
Yes.
We've talked about the respiratory values, right? And what we can glean from that. And I would love to have you back on and talk more into that. So dive into some actual tests, look at those results, and show the value of diving into the influx in data, where those inflection points are in the data, and what that teaches us about an individual's performance capability, kind of again, that where they're at, where they've been, and what to do next. I'm excited to see that with the respiratory stuff as well.
Absolutely. No, this will be super fun, diving into some of those limitations you talked about.
I look forward to it. Yeah, because it's a hot topic, and most people don't understand the physiology well enough of the ramifications of a respiratory limitation, nor how to train it properly. So it's a good way of unfortunately, of making money at this particular point, and selling books. But there is clarity. I can promise you.
I love
clarity.
It. Yeah. Well, I look forward to learning at the feet of the master of that. So that'll be great.
Absolutely. Well, and this is really what we want to do with this podcast, is to democratize this information and make it accessible. And so it's like, hey, these things are possible. Like you mentioned, Daniel, this is going to help us get clarity, because if we have clarity, then we save so much time and so much money, and we actually dial in the things that we're looking for. If we all had unlimited resources, time, money, yada, yada, we could do all these different things, but we don't. Everyone has constraints on their time, their resources, attention, all these different things. And so if we can give people the best information that are going to help them make the next right step for their health, then I think we've done our job, right? We have helped them understand their physiology in such a way that they can improve their lifestyle, so that they can show up in the ways that they want to, right? So they can, reach that podium, or at least finish the event, that they can, do things with their kids and grandkids, that people can live the life that they want to, and they don't have to be constrained by limitations that they're not able to discover without good data.
Yeah.
Agreed. I'm glad you hit all the populations too. It's so important that I just keep talking to people about the fact that, if you want to be really good at this, at your analysis, my God, work across all populations, because you really learn how to read the data well. Because especially with abnormal physiologies, guess what? You get blown outside the box anyway, because they're not responding in the usual way. But I also think that to turn that on its head, that's why metabolic analysis is so important in the medical field.
Yeah.
And I wish that there's a lot of talk about money being put into prevention. There's a lot of money being put into weight loss, especially with the new drugs. But there's no physiologists attached to any of this going, well, we can tell you accurately their BMR. We can accurately tell you their metabolic health. We can accurately zone. We can actually accurately prescribe the right exercise to make this so much better than what it is, and improve their health and decrease their risk of dying early or living a horrible last few years. I wish the medical community would embrace this more.
Yeah. And it is interesting. Honestly, lately, a lot of the people that I'm talking with, in terms of sales conversations and whatnot, are more medical facilities. I'm seeing a lot more uptick in, especially in the realm of like direct primary care or weight loss clinics or things like that. Clinics that are kind of stepping outside the box of the norm. We're not seeing as much in terms of like hospital systems and things, as much as private practitioners who are recognizing this as a game changer for their patients. And so I would love to see hospital systems and whatnot get involved and get on board with it, because I think the more mainstream it can become, the better. But it really is starting to catch fire, I guess, among some of the more innovative people within the healthcare community. And so I'm excited about that. I do think that we've seen some social media influencers have an impact there, and they talk about zone 2, and they talk about VO₂max, and both are great, and so it's been good. And then helping people define what those things really mean and how we actually measure them and stuff like that has also been a great opportunity. So I am encouraged by the fact that there is kind of once again light being shown on VO2, VCO2 testing, and kind of metabolic health. So I think there's a lot of future there, and giving people accurate zones so important in helping them not only hit their goals but stay healthy enough to hit their goals, because we're not overtraining them, so their likelihood of injury is much less, which is critical. You talk about working with all populations. If you're taking somebody that hasn't exercised in sometimes decades, and we're putting them on an exercise regimen, if we're starting out too aggressive and just training them according to what's popular instead of doing a test and finding out what does that body actually need, where are their individual zones. I tested somebody the other day where their zone 2 was like 90 beats per minute. They were that out of shape that's about what they could tolerate sustainably. And that we'll see that in 6 to 8 weeks jump up quite a bit. And in 6 months, we'll see it a totally different profile. But initially, if we trained much harder than that, we're going to see a lot more risk of injury, plantar fasciitis, knee pain, those things that interrupt most people's health journey as they start to try to get back in shape. And so by having that metabolic information, we see kind of what their limits of their body's tolerance for exercise are as well. And so we can help them more gradually get back to meaningful exercise. And so I love it for that reason as well, that we can help people really see what's right for my body right now. What can I tolerate right now?
Well, that's the when I designed my logo many years ago, there's 4 arrows pointing at a target. One, cardiovascular, respiratory, metabolic, and neuromuscular. And that's the 4th target as a physio and a sport physio is that can be a limitation to performance.
Oh yeah.
So you can't break them while you're trying to rebuild them. So that has to fit in. That those other structures have to take the load as well. So you're right. I mean, sometimes it's luckily enough the intensity that most deconditioned people are at doesn't require huge loads, which is nice.
Yeah.
The hard part is, if you ask me, the hardest population is those that are obese with poor lean muscle mass and a yet slow metabolic rating itself, that hate resistance training. It's sort of like getting them to the gym. Yes, and to get them to. Luckily, they don't have to really lift weights. That's what's nice. This is where you with our device and our testing is you can define that particular population. It's like hone in just like that and say, I'm sorry, I really apologize. I know you hate it, but you gotta do it. There's nothing else I can do about it. We have got to increase your lean muscle mass. That will have all the other profound effects of increasing bone density and improving the physiology at the cellular level as well. But those are the hardest ones to get. Is those that dislike it. It's like those that hate that the workout's not hard enough because it doesn't feel like they've done a workout. Try to get them to go slow. Those that hate to feel stressed, get them to go hard. There's all the personalities around everything as well. So it makes it even more fun. That's kind of the 5th arrow. Yeah,
the art versus the science of it, right?
Definitely. Well, and again, this technology allows us to individualize it, and we can use the data to help people get buy-in, right? Like, hey, we're seeing these values change. I know this is uncomfortable. I know this is new. Like, as we stick with it, we're actually seeing these really cool changes. And so this technology really bridges that gap from fitness through kind of that medical world and just creates a bridge.
Right. Well, and truly is precision medicine. We're able to really practice precision medicine with it. If you want an exercise prescription to be precise to that individual, a VO2 test is, in my estimation of things, critical. Mark and I always joke that, and we've said this on here before, that doing cardiovascular exercise without knowing your heart rate zones is somewhat akin to lifting weights without knowing how much weight is on the bar. It's not that you can't get a good workout. You just have no idea if you did or not. You have no idea the relative load on the system. Was this a hard workout or an easy workout? I don't really know, because I don't know relative to other workouts how much I lifted.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of this shot in the dark, and is why we see so many recreational runners have injuries and things like that. And it's because they're really just hoping that the run that I did today is the right one for where I'm at in my fitness and what my goals are.
Yep.
And so dialing that in with a proper metabolic test really does make things so much more accurate for the individual.
Absolutely. We could keep talking. I almost kept going, but we will have chances for future conversations. We'll get to dive into more of this data again with you. I'm super excited to have Daniel on again and have him go through some of the actual tests and talk about the things that he's looking for. Just a wealth of knowledge, and so we'll have more conversations like these. But we should probably end it before we go
start on a whole new topic.
3 hours later. No, but again, thanks so much for coming on, Daniel. We appreciate your time, and again, like I said, we'll tease those future episodes. Again, as always, remember to like, follow, and subscribe if you want more content like this, and we'll catch you next time. This podcast is a production of KORR Medical Technologies. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.